Well, hello and welcome to this episode of In Sync, where I'll be talking a little bit more about the archetypal layer of our inner architecture. Now, if you watch the episode on inner architecture, you would have understood that there are three layers to our inner architecture: our psychological layer, layer 1, our emotional and somatic layer, layer 2, and our archetypal layer, layer 3, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now, why would I want to have this here in this component? Why the archetypes? And as I mentioned in one of the previous episodes, a lot of personal development never goes down to this layer, never talks about this layer. And I think it's because, for the most part, it isn't really understood by a lot of folks. And but it is an area that I feel needs to be better understood, because I think it can really help us understand ourselves better, so that we can then use this to navigate through life and listen to what's going on inside us more as the world becomes more challenging and complex and harder to navigate and harder to figure out what's my place in this world. Why am I the way I am? And therefore, how can I feel effective and rewarded and successful and fulfilled in this world where I may be expected to be a certain way, and the way I've been raised and the way I've been taught, but yet, I've got these other parts of myself that perhaps I like to keep to myself or keep hidden or not be expressed, and I may not know, why I feel a certain way a lot of the time. So I'm hoping that some of these questions will be answered in this episode, because I think that could help us to understand the importance of this layer. So I won't be able to go into all of the archetypes in this episode, because there are quite a number of them. But in essence, there are 4 primary archetypes, which is what we will talk about in this episode. And then there are 12 sort of personality archetypes that we'll probably talk about in another episode, just to keep this one nice and tight. But so this matters, because when we understand particularly these 4 core archetypes, we can understand these different parts of ourselves and what they may be trying to express through us, that is actually trying to get our attention and trying to lead us towards what we're really looking for, that will not only fulfill us, but allow us to feel like we're actually making progress in our lives and experiencing the things that we really want, and to experience that level of peace, love, and joy, and prosperity, and abundance, and all those wonderful things that we're all really looking for. So this layer allows us to understand what's really going on at a deeper layer, in a deeper way. So here's the problem that many of us often don't see. We can often mistake the mask for the face. Now, what do I mean by that? We have this part of us that is our persona. Now, this is that part of us that we generally put on and show the world. This is the part that we feel is socially accepted and what society perhaps expects us to be. And we use this part of ourselves to navigate through life, navigate socially, interact with other people socially, and do things that help us to perhaps survive, or perhaps get by, or perhaps earn a living, and do the things that we feel we're expected to do. And it is what society often rewards, right? So this can be that part of us that perhaps we've gone to school to learn how to become, right? To become active, contributing members of society. And it's not all bad. We often need it to function in those different areas of life. But it can often keep another part of us quite repressed and hidden and unseen. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But this part of us, this persona part of us, is that part that you're probably very familiar with, because it's the one that's probably been the most conditioned and perhaps has seen the most light of day in your life. And it's the one that keeps things afloat, right? It keeps, like, as I mentioned before, it keeps the bills getting paid. It keeps you feeling accepted socially. And it's that part that can, over time, tend to dominate the way we express ourselves. But if we allow this part of ourselves to dominate for too long and be expressed for too long, then these other parts of ourselves that I'll get to in a moment can fall away, and they can be repressed and perhaps shoved aside and not heard. And they can often carry really important messages to us about what we need to do next, or what we need to integrate into our lives. And it's these parts of ourselves that represent the truth, because our authentic selves are not one-dimensional. We're not here to just be this one thing. And often this persona can be this one thing that society expects us to be. Maybe that's our professional identity, right? Who we're expected to be at work or in our business. And we can often define ourselves as this persona. And for example, it may show up as, well, I'm a doctor, or I'm a corporate professional, or I'm a CEO, or I'm a sporting athlete. And therefore, that may be how I tend to define myself to the world, through this persona. And that may be how the world identifies me, because we're expressing ourselves through our persona so often. But we're not designed to be just this one thing. And that's what I love about the archetypes, because what it does is it really shows us that we're not one thing. We're here to be many things. And in fact, we're here to be all things and experience all things. And that doesn't mean that we're here to be all these different professions. It means there are these different parts of ourselves that we'll discover in this episode and the next episode that I'll do on archetypes, which won't be the very next episode. It'll be another episode in the future that I'll do on the personality archetypes. But these different parts of ourselves are also what we're here to express in our lives. So if you're feeling like something's missing, if you're feeling like you're perhaps a little bit lost, if you're feeling like, what you do each day is feeling like a bit of a grind, or feeling quite monotonous or unfulfilling, or not, giving you the level of peace and joy and love and prosperity in your life, it may be because your persona has gotten too much energy. Perhaps that's gotten out of balance, and these other parts of yourself, it may need to give them a little bit more time. So that sort of brings us nicely onto the shadow. And this is this other part of ourself that is kind of the flip of the persona, right? And this is that part of ourselves that we often, as I mentioned a little bit before, this is one of the parts that we tend to keep hidden from the world, because this is where we feel things inside of ourselves, or we think a certain way, or we like to act, and we may keep that part hidden behind closed doors, or we might have some of these desires that we want to express in different contexts of our lives. Maybe we want to do something professionally that is coming up within us, but we were never trained to be through school and our educations or our jobs, and therefore we might find it hard to find out, well, where does this fit into my life? I got this other part of me, I've got these other desires. I don't just want to be, like in my case, I don't just want to be an IT consultant. I love personal development, but I don't know if I start talking about personal development in my professional life, will it be accepted? And certainly in those areas of my life, in that professional corporate space that was really focused on, doing the work that was expected of me in my professional role, in my persona, right? Then this shadow part of me that just loved personal development and was passionate about personal development and wanted to express more of that, I kept that shoved aside, and I separated these two parts of myself. And in my spare time, I would often go off and to these personal development events and fulfill that part of myself. But when it came to integrating it into my professional life, I didn't allow them to be integrated. I kept them quite separate. And I had these two lives, right? I had these social lives over here in my personal development world. I had these great friends over here, and then I had my professional life, and I didn't allow the two to mix. But you can't shove this aside. You can't hide it. You can't deny it. It's there, whether you like it, whether you feel comfortable to express it or not. So this shadow part of ourselves is often the one that can contain some of our fears, right? It can have some of those, perhaps some ways of being that we are afraid for the world to see, because we will feel like it may be rejected, right? Or it might not be accepted. And it's not that you necessarily need to say, well, Christian's talking about expressing the shadow, so I now need to go and express this in the area of my life where my persona dominates. It's not so much that at all. It's about honoring this part of ourselves and realizing, well, where can I express it, or how can I allow my shadow to be seen and integrating into my life by understanding it a little deeper and understanding those fears. And therefore, how can I invite my shadow to walk alongside my persona so that the two can work together instead of feeling like we're working against each other all the time. So it can often show up at times like when you're least expected, right? So I know for me, it would often wake me up at certain times of the day when I was trying to sleep, right? So there I am trying to sleep so I can get up the next day and express my persona in my professional life, in my professional work. And then I was often waking up between 2 and 3 a.m. and just wide awake. It's because this shadow part of myself wasn't seeing the light of day. It wasn't showing up in my regular life that I was showing the world. So it can show up at those times because it's trying to get your attention. It's trying to get you to listen to it. It doesn't want to be left out. So it can often be triggered in ways that might show up. You might get caught sometime, when you're expressing it at times when you're trying to hide it, and someone might walk in, and see you, drawing something or playing around with something that it may be a different course or a different program, and you may feel that it's a part of you that you've got to hide. So you tend to keep it hidden behind closed doors. So sometimes it can show up in that way. So now when we stop fighting it though, and we start integrate it, is that we can get new insights and we can start to see a new path when we make a conscious decision to invite our shadow to show up more in our lives, but to allow it to show up in ways that can integrate with other parts of ourselves and not feel like it has to be separate. Because when we do that, then we can find the answers to what we're looking for. So therefore, how can it show up? How can I allow my shadow to show up in such a way that I don't have to feel like it's so hidden? And therefore, I can then find greater freedom in that I don't have to feel like there's this part of myself that I have to keep hidden from the world. It allows a new sense of freedom to emerge. And as I'll talk about in some of the next episodes, one of the main things that we're often seeking when we're looking for more money, because a lot of us are looking for more money, money is a challenge for a lot of us. What that often is a real desire for freedom. And again, I'll go into that a little bit more in the next, in one of the next episodes. But we don't have to have more money in order to experience freedom. We can give ourselves that sense of freedom by giving ourselves permission to allow these other parts of ourselves to be freely expressed. And when we can do that, we can experience a greater sense of freedom that can often lead us to those external things that we're often chasing. So by stop fighting our shadow, and when we start integrate it, we can see new possibilities, new answers. And I know for me, for example, I never would have discovered the InSync OS and never had these ideas and these insights come to me if I didn't integrate these two, because the InSync OS does represent these two core parts of myself: my persona, which was this IT professional driving, large scale enterprise systems and implementing those to help businesses perform. But then there was this personal development side of me. So what I've been able to do is I've been able to see the similarities between what I was learning in technology about how systems worked. And I was also seeing a lot of what I was learning in personal development about what we need as human beings and what we're often looking for as human beings. And I was seeing similarities, and it gave birth to this InSync OS, where I could bring some of the two concepts together, right? Because we often think about operating systems as these technology devices that help our technology devices function. But an operating system can apply to any context and any domain. And we also have an operating system in our personal lives. So what I've been able to do with the InSync OS is I've been able to bring this persona that I was expressing to the world, which was this, IT professional, and this shadow part of myself, which was this person that had this love for personal development, who was developing into a speaker and a coach and a thought leader. That kind of shadow was also, needing to be expressed. And I've brought the two together now so that I'm honoring both sides. Right? So this is what's possible. And as a result of that, I've gained a hell of a lot of clarity and certainty and therefore drive to and direction, right? Because of being able to see this. And now I can see how I don't have to keep these two lives separate anymore. I can actually navigate them together. And it's given me a huge sense of clarity on, therefore, creating a podcast and the kind of content that I want to create, when before that I had a lot of confusion and conflicting thoughts that would come up and a lack of certainty. So when we stop fighting this shadow, we can often see that when we start stepping into it, embracing it, a new sense of clarity can show up in our life and give us a new sense of direction. And when we can trust it and step into it, new possibilities emerge. New opportunities can begin to emerge and find us. So that then brings us to the self. Now, this is a part that we may think is the ego, but this is different to the ego, right? So our ego is usually that part of ourself that is usually very self-centered or self-serving. It's often more concerned about the self than anyone else, right? Me. But when it comes to our archetypes, this self archetype is the one archetype within us that is trying to unite all the different parts of ourselves, and it's trying to move us towards wholeness. So in some of the other episodes, you might have recalled, if you've watched them, that I talked about this process that Carl Jung talked about called individuation. Now, this is our innate drive in our lives to move from our small self to our small self to our greater self and who we really are. And it's constantly inviting us to expand and grow through this process of individuation to becoming our true selves, our greater selves. So our self is that part that wants to integrate all these different parts of ourselves and help us to experience lives of greater wholeness. So it's always working towards bringing all these parts of ourselves together. So it's the part that also doesn't want us to stay stuck and safe in the small self, but the ego often wants to keep us safe and stuck in our small self. The ego often doesn't want us to expand, right? Because that can create a whole new set of fears and of becoming more and therefore taking on more responsibility. And often the fear of success can show up here when the ego gets challenged by the self, right? The self wants us to expand. And that can often sometimes feel a little bit scary when we have these other desires within us that we can feel, that we can sense, and we get ideas about, and we get feelings about, but we often keep ourselves down and hidden and small. And that's often when we allow the ego to control us and to control our decisions based on our persona, dominating and driving us to express ourselves the way the world wants to express ourselves. But our self wants us to unite and integrate our persona as well as our shadow. And the next archetypes that I'll talk about in just a moment. But that archetype of ourself is the one that is often driving us to uncover our true identity, right? But integrate it with our top-down or our conditioned identity. So you may recall from the previous episodes, if you've watched them, that I talk about in the inner architecture episode how we have this top-down conditioning that often occurs as we start life and then grow up through our upbringing and into adulthood. And we can experience this top-down conditioning from our psychological layer down, right? And that's what we can often refer to as what happens when we're building an identity. That is where our identity is getting built, and often without our conscious control. Then we can move through life and we can start to understand more about ourselves, and we can start to try and build our own identity from a more conscious place. If we learn more about personal development and we learn more about the identity, we can start to consciously control how we build our identity. But then we can also tap into this layer, this archetypal layer, and we can learn to uncover our true identity rather than just trying to build an identity, which we can then only end up finding that if we're building an identity, we can only end up reinforcing the persona, because we can think that we have to build more and more and add more and more strength to our persona. So by uncovering our true identity, which can occur through this archetypal layer, we can begin to listen deep to this deeper part of ourselves that's really trying to show us who our real self is, who our authentic and true self is. And that way we can start listening to that, we can start honoring that, we can start stepping into that and moving forward and allowing new experiences to support that new path going forward, so that we can uncover our true or authentic identity. Now that then brings us to the last of the core archetypes that I want to talk about in this episode, which is the anima and the animus. Now the anima is that inner feminine side of a man. And this is the side that is more intuitive, more nurturing, more caring perhaps, and more sensitive. And then the animus is the inner masculine side of a woman. Now this is that part that is perhaps more rational, more objective, represents more strength and autonomy. And this is the side of a woman that has really been given a lot more permission for women to express over the last 4 or 5 decades through the feminist movement, right? A lot of women have really learned how to tap more into their animus and been able to succeed in those areas of life, in those areas of the world that were traditionally male dominated, right? And we're still seeing that, there are a lot of women are wanting to make more progress in this area, which, I believe is a really good thing for humanity. That women have become so much more successful and driven in parts of the world that were more masculine dominated and male dominated for so long. It's really bringing a lot of balance. And this side of ourselves though is a part, the opposite side of ourselves though is one that is sometimes repressed or shoved down. So for a long time, this animus side for women was one that was generally being kept down by a lot of men in the world, because they didn't want to allow women, or they didn't see women as having a place in these male dominated areas of the world. And for men, a lot of men have been discouraged from expressing more of their anima, more of their feminine side, because it's often communicated as weak and therefore not manly to express these sides of ourselves. But we can't hide the fact that we have both sets of energies within us. It's just all about recognizing our core energy and therefore allowing ourselves and giving ourselves permission to find a balance, and where is it appropriate for us to nurture and express our opposite energy, right? So, and we've seen a lot of women getting better and better at this in business, for example, and other areas of lives. And that can often mean that for a lot of men have found that they've gotten a little lost in seeing a lot of women becoming more and more successful in traditionally male-dominated areas, and therefore a lot of men have gotten a little bit confused around, well, what's my role now, right? That can often happen. So if we don't find a balance between these areas, then we can often find that we're only allowing one to be expressed and the other, because we can often feel like society is expecting us to only show up as one and not the other. But this can often lead to problems and imbalances that can lead to a number of different issues, right? So for example, what I've noticed is that as a lot of women have been encouraged to tap into more of their masculine when it comes to their professional lives, what has often happened is they've then lost touch with their core energy, their core feminine energy, and has then impacted their intimate relationships, right, with masculine men. Because what's happening is that a lot of women who are showing up more in their animus then tend to also bring that energy into their intimate relationships, because they've done it all day long at work, and then they come home and they're still in their animus, they're still in their masculine, and they don't have that polarity, that chemistry, therefore, with their masculine men is being lost. Because polarity occurs where you have both sides, right? Where you have both the masculine and the feminine. So this can often lead to some challenges in personal relationships if we're not in touch with, or when we haven't learned how to allow ourselves to move between both sides, right? So in that last example that I just mentioned, where a woman may be able to nurture her masculine in her professional life so that she can, succeed and dominate her career in her industry, then, she may need to be encouraged to step back into her feminine and flow back into her feminine in her intimate relationship, so she can find that chemistry and balance in her intimate relationship, and therefore allow both sides to be fulfilled. So we don't want to make either side wrong here. It's just a matter of understanding, when is it appropriate for me to use this side of me, and when is it appropriate for me to use this side of me. And the same goes for men. I know for me, when I stepped into my career, the feminine side of me was often made out to be wrong. It was that I felt like, I wanted to be more caring and nurturing and more intuitive in my professional world, but I was often told that I wore my heart in my sleeve too often, and I needed to keep this part of myself that cared about people and that wanted to nurture people and that wanted to listen to people and really be a little bit more sensitive to people's needs. I wasn't really allowed to express that side, because it was all about the masculine stuff, right? The dominate, the results, the structure, the strength, the autonomy. That was what I was being told was, the way to succeed in my professional life. But this other side of me also had a place, also in my professional life. And what then began to happen is that I was finding that I was a bit too feminine in my personal life, and that was then affecting my intimate relationships, because I was just not showing up as masculine, because in my intimate relationships I was showing up more feminine, because this side of myself wasn't expressing myself in balance. So I often found that I was not showing up as the masculine man in my intimate relationships, and that was affecting the polarity in my intimate relationships, because the women that I was in partnerships with were sensing that often I would be a bit more submissive or a bit more feminine, and therefore they weren't finding me to be as attractive, because what they were really looking for in intimate relationships was a masculine man. So I had to really learn to find that balance and to allow the masculine that was dominating in my professional life to also show up in my personal life. So we can often find that this archetype here, the anima or the animus, is really an important one to tap into, because it can help you see where the answers may be to some of the challenges that you may be experiencing in your professional life and in your personal lives, by understanding and allowing this part of ourselves to also be integrated. So there's a lot more I can talk about, and I can definitely do, and I'd like to do an episode just on this, because this is definitely an area that I think is gotten a little bit out of balance in our world. But certainly I've noticed that in the professional environments especially, even though we are seeing more and more women in what were traditionally male-dominated environments, and we're seeing a lot more women succeed in there as we move towards equality in those areas, what I've still been noticing is that masculine energy still dominates, right? Even when we're seeing women in very high-powered positions, they're still often operating with a very masculine way of operating, very much about the strength and the autonomy, and have perhaps lost touch with the feminine side. And just my own personal take on it is that what we need to start doing more and more is we need to start embracing the role of the feminine in a lot of these structured business environments. A lot of the feminine energy that wants to nurture and listen and be more intuitive, especially as the world becomes more complex and harder to navigate. Tapping into more of our intuition, to more of our feminine energy within these environments, whether you're a man or a woman or how you identify, being more in touch with the feminine in these environments, I think can drive a greater balance in these traditionally male-dominated environments, or traditionally masculine-dominated environments, right? And bring greater balance, and therefore allow us to stop rejecting the role of the feminine in these environments and begin nurturing teams, greater harmony, greater synergy, things that a lot of feminine women do naturally well, but aren't allowed to, and or aren't given permission to express in these areas of the world that were traditionally male dominated. So this is how we can find that each day, as we start to begin to understand these different archetypes and how they play out, it can therefore allow us to show up a little differently. So this is a way that you can begin listening to yourself today, creating the space and time, perhaps do a silent meditation and consciously set an intention to invite that your self, that self archetype, to start to feature a little more in your life, and also your parts of your shadow too, right? So it may be easy to see that that perhaps this is a little bit too psychological and abstract. It's a little bit too out there. But I think that this is actually a more practical framework that we could use. And this comes from what I've observed from many years in personal development, where we're teaching so much about mindset, and there are so many different mindsets out there. And I've just found that it's just getting more and more difficult to understand and then master all these different mindsets, which all take a lot of energy to master on their own. It takes a lot of work to master a new mindset. And yes, you can make a quick shift, in a short period of time, but to really change your mindset with all these different mindsets that are out there now, that can just become really overwhelming at times, I've found. So for me, knowing that there are these 4 core archetypes that we can start to listen to me makes this a lot more manageable. It makes this a much more manageable way to start driving your core direction in life, right? Is to start getting in touch with these 4 core archetypes. And then we'll talk about the personality archetypes a little later on. But even if we only have 4 core archetypes and 12 personality archetypes to understand, to me, that's far more manageable than the plethora of different mindsets that we've got to master. So that to me makes this far more practical. 4 main things to learn at this deeper archetypal level that allow our true identities to start to be heard and understood and nurtured and expressed. So this can then start to shift the way you make decisions, right? Starting to listen to my shadow and learning how to integrate it with my persona, allowing myself to unify and integrate them, and listening to my anima or my animus, right? And therefore allowing these things to be heard and starting to make decisions from that place, right? So where in my intimate relationship could I perhaps listen to my anima or my animus that's trying to be heard, that can improve my intimate relationship, right? And where can I allow my shadow to show up a little bit more in my professional life, where I'm allowing my persona to dominate, and therefore could I allow that to allow my shadow perhaps to make a decision that could nurture that part of me and that part of myself. So with that, we'd kind of wrap up this episode. And what I'd like to do is just invite you to sit with what we've talked about in this episode today. And how could you allow yourself to lead your archetype self, right? How could you allow that archetype of self to start leading and start paying attention to these different archetypes within you, and invite that part of you to start showing up and to start revealing itself? Because my guess is that what we've discussed in this episode has begun to trigger some thoughts. Perhaps you've been able to reflect upon where you've seen these different areas of yourself showing up, perhaps the areas that you've been neglecting, or perhaps the areas that you've been giving a little bit too much attention to. And therefore, how could you allow that to then move you towards greater wholeness and integration? So that is where we would then sort of end off this episode on that. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope that it's been of value to you. And if you need to go back and watch some of the other episodes for part of the framework, please feel free to go and do so. And therefore, I'll see you in the next episode.